Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitch and Tree Quilts, and I am the designer of the COVID Friends Tribute Quilt. Previously, I recorded a session that had the instructions for all the block units for row 1, the 3 blocks in the row and the alternate block. And as I stated in those instructions, I would have a separate video, that's what this is, a primer, if you will, of paper piecing for the Big Apple stem. Here's my Big Apple block in bright and cheery cottons and prints. And you can see the stem unit here. That's a paper piece stem unit. Today, for our example for the video, I'll be using my deep and rich cottons and prints for my Big Apple block, and I will show you how to do the paper piece stem. Let's take a look at the pattern. Page 4 of your pattern has the template, and on the template, in this section right here, I've noted that when you print your paper pattern out, make sure that your template is printing at 100%. Some printers call it printing actual size, but make sure it's printing at 100% because oftentimes printers automatically scale the template down. Before you begin that paper piecing, measure your unit because from this point here to the cutoff, the engineered corner, it should measure exactly 3 1/2 inches. If it does not measure exactly 3 1/2 inches, then your printer has scaled the unit down and it's not going to piece or fit correctly on your unit. You'll also see that on the template, I indicate that A1, A3, and A5 are background fabrics, A4 is your stem fabric, and A2 is your leaf fabric. You're going to need, in this background fabrics, for this A5, you're going to need a 3-inch piece of fabric. And the rest of the pieces, the 2-inch square will work fine. There are a lot of different ways to paper piece. And the method that I like to use, because I don't do a lot of paper piecing, but I like to do it kind of quick and easy, is I will take the time to fold on every one of the lines. I will make a fold, and I'll crease that fold nicely with my ruler. And I will fold every one of the lines before I begin my paper piecing. A lot of paper piecing teachers will teach you that you should use a light box or a window to draw the lines on the back side. I personally don't do that. I just use my folded pieces. I do draw around the outside edge of my unit, so I make sure that I have enough fabric attached that includes my 1/4-inch seam. And I do take the time to write the colors of the fabrics for each one of the units that I'm going to be using. Paper piecing is different because you are sewing through paper and the fabric is on the back side and you don't see that. I like to set my machine to 1.5 on my stitching scale so that it's a really compressed stitch that stitches those units in place. And that'll be helpful to perforate this paper and make it easy to remove the paper later. So set that stitch length very, very tight. If your machine is on a scale of 1 to 5, 1.5 is good. If your machine actually does stitches per inch, you're going to want to increase your stitches per inch to about a 16 or an 18, maybe even a 20 stitches per inch. The paper piece pattern has all of the letters and the numbers that you need to construct your paper piece units, A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5, and that's the order that you'll piece them. You'll note that A1, A3, and A5 are background units, A2 is a leaf unit, and A4 is a stem unit. Each of those have a color, and I mark those colors right here on the back of my pattern so I can see what colors go where. I've got my white, my white, my white of background. B is my brown for stem. G is my green for the leaf. You'll begin in the order that it states it on the pattern. A1 is my background. A2 is my leaf. So I'm going to want to take those two pieces and I want to make sure that they're going to fit in such a way that they will cover the whole unit. I'll take my A1 piece of fabric and I can see that I have completely covered where that's going to stitch. I can lay my A2 fabric even with that so that it extends beyond that 1/4 inch seam allowance and it extends beyond 1/4 of an inch of this stitching allowance here. And I can see that when I press that open, it will fully cover my A2 stem. Now, if I was using directional fabric or something where I have to try to be mindful of a direction, maybe I had something that looks like a leaf, I would make sure I want to position that appropriately for that. That being said, I take my unit, I flip over my piece of paper, and I can take my white and green unit. I can see my line. Remember, I talked about folding those on the line. There is my fold between A1 and A2. Here's my white. I'll lay my white right on that. I'm exceeding my 1/4 of an inch of the seam allowance, and I'm going to flip the unit over so I can see it one more time and make sure that I have that in position. So number 1 was my white, my background, going to my green stem. I can see I have my white. I can see I have my green stem. I take my Marty Michelle square up ruler where I have a real good 1/4 inch, and I lay it along the unit to make sure I have a 1/4 inch seam, and it looks like I'm in good shape. Now, you can do a couple of different things. In order to keep it in position as I move it to my machine, I can drop a dot of glue there or use a glue stick, or because it's such a small piece, I just like to place my ruler under the unit like so. And I'll use my ruler as the carrier. I'll flip it back over, and this will be the unit that I need to stitch first between A1 and A2. I can double check and make sure I have everything in position. And it looks like I'm good to sew. On my machine, I have changed my stitches per inch to a 1.5, and I'm going to bring my unit over to my machine. I'm going to remove the ruler, and I need to stitch off the edge of the line all the way to that seam. So I will begin outside of my seam allowance, drop my needle into position. So my needle is in position, and now I'm going to stitch, and I will stop right there. You bring up both of your threads and you hold them. And I'm holding it in place. It's important to have an open-toed foot so you can see where you're going. And I will stop right where that A1, A2 line meets the A4 line. Bring my needle up, take the unit out of my machine, and trim my threads. I'll take it back over to my ironing pad. Once I'm at my ironing pad, I take my iron, I turn my green unit over, and I press along that seam. Sometimes I like to set that seam first, making it easier for that to press open. And I just hold the iron on the unit, count to 5 bananas, using a nice hot iron. I do not use steam because that will introduce stretch into your unit, and the whole purpose of having a paper piece unit is to have nice, sharp, straight lines. So I know that doesn't look like a lot, but it does cover my stem. The next thing I need to do is I need to fold back the unit on that A2, A3 line. So I'll fold back the paper along that line. I like to slip a little cutting mat underneath it. And the next thing I'll be adding to that is a white unit. But first I need to cut and trim that green to a 1/4 inch. And once I've done that, I can take my white unit, lay it under that green unit, matching up that 1/4 inch line. I know that I'm exceeding my seam allowance here. I can see I'm exceeding my seam allowance here. If I had any doubt as to whether or not that would cover my unit, I can take that same piece add it to the top and take a look, and I've completely covered where the white needs to go. So I'll lay that on line right there. Again, I'll take my ruler and slide it underneath so I can transport it to my machine. Fold the paper over and take it over to my machine. Once at my machine, again, I slide the ruler out. If I'm nervous about that, I can always double check to make sure that both pieces of fabric are there and in place, and they are. I move it to my machine, drop down my presser foot, hold my thread, put my needle in position. Again, I'm off the seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch it off the seam allowance this direction. So I'll go past the line, and I'll use that folded line to continue to follow it off the edge of that seam allowance. Needle up, I can remove it from my machine and trim those threads and take it back to my pressing mat. Once I have it at my pressing mat, I take my iron to set the seam, fold the seam over, press, counting to 5 bananas. And that part of the unit is complete. A1, A2, A3. I trim all threads. The next unit to add would be the A4 unit. So I turn it in such a way that I can get to that A4 unit, making sure that all of those pieces are laying flat underneath. And I fold my paper over on the A4 line. And as long as I have not extended my stitching beyond the line, I won't have a problem. Again, I take my cutting mat, lay it underneath, take my Marty Michelle tool to cut that 1/4 inch. And the next thing I need to add is my brown stem. And here's my brown stem fabric. And I know my stem needs to exceed my seam allowance here and here. So I will place it under my unit so that it matches up with the 1/4 inch and yet exceeds that seam allowance. If I have any questions, I can always double check. Looks like it's going to match up just fine. So once again, I take my ruler, I slide it under the unit to transport it to my machine. And you could just use a piece of template plastic to transport that. However, it's most convenient for you, but somehow you got to get the unit from here to your machine. Once at my machine, I double check that my fabric is in place. I slide my ruler out. If I want to double check one more time, I can sure turn that paper up one more time. Slide it into position. I've got my fold line here at the point of the triangle. Hold my threads, put my needle in the down position, and I'm going to stitch straight off the seam allowance, following my line and my fold line. I'll stitch straight right there. Trim my threads and go back to my iron. Once I'm at the iron, I place my iron on there to set the seam, fold the unit over, and press it in place. Turn it back over so you're at the side where you can see the numbers. This is where I like to put my cutting mat down. I'll fold it on the A4, A5 line. Place my Marty Michelle ruler there so I can see my 1/4 inch. And there are rulers called add a quarter. Those work really well too. Trim that unit off at 1/4 inch. Now I'm ready to add my last white unit. That unit needs to be about 3 inches square. A 2.5 by 2.5 inch piece might work as well. I'm going to slide that under so that it matches up with my cut line, making sure that I exceed my seam allowance on this side. I exceed my seam allowance on this side. If there's any question whether or not it will fit on the unit, I lay it in place and I can see that I've exceeded my seam allowance there as well. So I lay those together. I can slide my ruler into place to hold it in position as I move it over to my machine. I'm ready for my last seam. At my machine, I've removed that ruler that was holding it in place. I can see that my units are still in line. Again, I'm going to grab those threads and I'm going to begin just outside the seam allowance. All that straight line and go off the edge to the next seam allowance. Remove it from my machine, trim the threads, take it back to the iron for the last time, and I'm going to set the seam. Press the seam, holding it for 5 seconds. And while this may not look the way it should look, doesn't look like that stem unit yet, we now need to go ahead and cut off on the seam line. So I'll get the pressing mat back into position. And it's important that you make sure that none of your fabrics have folded back over as you turn the unit over. So you can do that by feeling it, by checking it, check those edges. And once you've checked those edges and you are sure that everything is out of the way, go ahead and take your ruler and your rotary cutter and cut along the straight lines of the unit. We'll engineer those corners off last. As far as the engineered corners go, you can either just eyeball it with your rotary cutter or you can use your ruler, whichever you prefer. They're not very big cuts. And that will engineer those corners off, making it easier for this to attach to your apple. Then you simply hold your paper in place, lift the sides off of it, and pull everything out of the way. And when I flip this over, that should look like that stem unit. And there it is. But now we need to remove the paper. And this is where having stitched it with such a short stitching seam makes it very, very easy to do. And you can start with any edge, it doesn't matter. You're going to just fold that back over, perforate that a little more, and just pop that off with your finger. I like to go in the reverse order of how I stitched them on. So A5 would come off first. A4 would come off next. A3 I've already removed. A2. Follows. And A1 would be last. There we have a perfectly paper pieced stem unit. Now before we add this to our apple, we want to remember to switch our machine back to the 2.5 or 12 stitches per inch. Some machines it's as simple as hitting a clear button, others you have to reset. If you don't reset, you end up with a really tight stitching line that when you want to remove a seam, it makes it extremely difficult to remove that seam. Here is my apple unit, and I'm ready to match the center seam, which is this long seam right here, with the center of that apple unit. I like to use a fork pin on either side of that seam to set it in place. And you can see my engineered corners match up nicely with the outside edge of that apple unit. I'll go ahead and run that through my machine using my regular stitches per inch. I like to use my 9-patch units as beginners and enders. This one happens to be for my batik quilt. Ready to feed that apple unit through the machine. As I come up on that fork pin, I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position, remove the fork pin, and continue to stitch across the end of that seam. Another beginner and ender. Set the seam by pressing your iron and leaving it there for a few seconds, and then turn that to the outside and press. The pattern calls for this unit to be pressed to the outside. So it might take a few seconds longer because of the depth of those seams. You'll notice that my stem matches up perfectly with my apple seam. And now all I need to do is add the other 2 half square triangles here on either end. So I'll follow the pattern to add those 2 units, and my block will be complete. I've added my half square triangles to the sides, pressed them to the outside as the pattern calls for. And with those engineered corners, it makes it press perfectly, and I don't even have a dog ear to turn. And I love the way the apple looks. So now I'm ready to add my apple in with the rest of my collection of my 9 patches there in my deep and rich fabrics. And I'll move on to my next blocks, and then when I'm ready to go ahead and set them in the block set, I'll do a separate video for the block sets. If you have any questions regarding paper piecing or how to piece this unit together, just give us a call, send me an email, drop a message on our Facebook page. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Thank you and have a blessed day.